I've been tasked today with giving you a bit of an introductory talk on the Flavian dynasty, which forms part of the OCR A-level ancient history curriculum. Now, giving a rundown on an entire dynasty is, of course, impossible to achieve in 10 minutes, but I thought I'd give you basically a few tips on how to teach the Flavians from my own experience of teaching them at university at level 1. The history of the Roman imperial period, which is the time that came after the Republic, is in many ways, I guess, the history of the emperors. And this means a lot of names and dynasties and family trees and memorizing the date ranges of different emperors' periods of rule. And all of this can be a bit overwhelming for students and even for us as professional ancient historians. And I've always found that the way to bring life to this long timeline of names and dates and key events like battles and so on is to spend a bit of time acquainting students with the key personalities. And this gives a sense of the actual people behind all of these key events and developments. And in my view, the way into the Flavians is really through the personalities of the three emperors concerned, so Vespasian, Titus and Domitian. And I'm quite pleased to see that this is exactly what the OCR curriculum does as well. For the Flavians, we have the dubious fortune that we have the late 1st, early 2nd century historian and biographer Suetonius to give us all the juicy gossip. And this forms an excellent contrast to the drier and more serious and infinitely more reliable historical narrative of Tacitus for this period. The best way to get a handle on the 1st century emperor's personalities is to read Suetonius's biographies. Now, none of Suetonius should be necessarily taken at face value. He was more interested in reproducing tittle-tattle than preserving the truth, but he did try to capture an image of each of the emperors he writes about and to give the reader some insight into their respective personalities. Vespasian, as the first Flavian emperor, is really the key personality in this period. And if Suetonius is to be believed, he was indeed quite a character. Now, the basic background is as follows. The Flavians were the first dynasty after the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So in other words, they were the first emperors who could not claim direct descendants from this great archetypal first emperor Augustus as the basis of their legitimacy. The other key factor is the bloody civil war of 69 that occurred after Nero was assassinated, which forms the time basis for the beginning of the Flavian period. Vespasian was triumphant in that particular civil war, and the fact that military might, and the fact that it was military might that won the day, was something that needed to be played down by Vespasian. As, of course, Roman emperors in this period were supposed to be civic leaders and not military dictators. The people of Rome still expected a vestige of balance of power, which meant also including the Senate. Now, the reason Vespasian was successful in this and managed to found a new dynasty is largely because of the kind of person he was and the kinds of decisions he made as a result of that personality. Vespasian was somewhat of a welcome change from the rather neurotic and quite theatrical Julio-Claudians, certainly the later Julio-Claudians. He was basically a wizened old no-nonsense military commander who was very robust and weather-beaten, was very rarely ill. And it's significant that the more serious and conscientious Tacitus was also largely complimentary of Vespasian and said that he was the only emperor to have improved on the job, the norm having been until this stage that power had tended to have gone to most emperors' heads, and things had deteriorated during their rule. Two key things I think stick out about Vespasian as a man. Firstly, his sense of humour, and secondly, his inherent pragmatism and humility. So to start with his sense of humour. Suetonius tells us that Vespasian had quite a strong sense of humour, and he was known for his witticisms, most famously, for example, on his deathbed, and in reference to the fact that emperors tended to be deified after they died. Deified means declared gods. Vespasian is said on his deathbed to have exclaimed, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." And this can be found in Suetonius's biography of Vespasian 24. Now, if you really want to make your students giggle, you could relate the anecdote from chapter 20 of Vespasian's biography, where Suetonius tells us, Vespasian was well built with strong, sturdy limbs and the expression of one who was straining on the toilet. One day, Vespasian asked a courtier to make a joke about him, and the courtier replied, "I will, when you've finished relieving your bowels." And I have to admit, every time I see a coin of Vespasian or find one on one of my digs and see his characteristic scrunched up face, I have to think of this anecdote. The second and perhaps more important thing about Vespasian was his pragmatism. He was a very pragmatic and, by all accounts, quite humble person. In chapter 21 of Suetonius's biography of Vespasian, he tells us, this was his general manner of life. When emperor, he always rose very early, in fact, before daylight. Then, after reading his letters and the reports of all the officials, he admitted his friends, and while he was receiving their greetings, he put on his own shoes and dressed himself. He put on his own shoes and dressed himself. And this was a huge change from previous emperors who had expected everything to be done for them. So here is Suetonius trying to give us an impression of this person who's very pragmatic and humble and does things for himself. This is a contrast to the previous emperors. So if you start by giving students a bit of an idea of who Vespasian was, the kind of man he was, through anecdotes like this, then you have a framework for all of the very wise decisions that he made, which are outlined in the curriculum. For example, he was quick to make friends with the Senate, and this showed humility and a return to the kind of balance of power people associated with the golden age of Augustus, for example. And like Augustus, and arguably all wise leaders, he was also very good at choosing loyal and very capable other men to help him run things. So he was not the sort of paranoid monomaniac that a lot of the later Julio-Claudian emperors had been. And some of these people, some of his right-hand men, are also outlined in the OCR curriculum. Vespasian was good at choosing symbolic acts that would make him popular. The central temple of the Roman state, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitol in Rome, had fallen into disrepair under the Julio-Claudians, and not only did Vespasian immediately resolve to restore it to its former glory, but he also is said to have started the building work with his own hands. And this is in Suetonius's biography of Vespasian, chapter 8. So again, he's showing his humility, his pragmatism. And he also got other major building projects underway in Rome, including the Colosseum, what later became known as the Colosseum, which was finished by his son Titus when Vespasian died in 79 AD. All of this kind of building activity was hugely important because it showed he was restoring Rome after a period of collapse and chaos. He also managed to sort out Rome's financial difficulties that had arisen from Nero's excesses and this period of civil war, which was very destructive. And finally, one of the most important things he did was to present himself in images, especially on coins, with his two sons, Titus and Domitian. And this was a very pragmatic move on his part because he knew that what the Roman people wanted after a series of bloody successions and an awful civil war was stability. So by setting up his sons as his successors, he was presenting to the Roman people a ready-made dynasty, and as such, stability for the foreseeable future. An example of this kind of presenting himself with his sons can be seen in the coin in figure 3.7 in the OCR curriculum. Coins are very important for the history of the emperors, and so in general, when you're looking at coins with students, make sure that they realise the importance of coins for what we might call these days propaganda. Coins had both a text on them and an image, and so they were the ideal medium for presenting an image. And because coins were used by virtually everyone in the empire, when they went to the market, when they paid people, when they got their pay, they had these things in their hands on a daily basis. They were the main way in which emperors communicated their image and their ideology to the people of the empire. Access to the text that I've talked about is perhaps something we can talk about when we meet up at the conference, and any other questions that you have about any of the things that I've said today.